deep dive where we talk about political issues shaping lives across Canada.
Today, we begin with the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls and how intersectionality explains this ongoing disproportionate violence against Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit LGBTQIA+ individuals in particular. Understanding the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls requires looking at the historical context that shaped the inquiry and the movement. Colonialism plays a huge part in this. It actually creates the conditions of violence that Indigenous people face today. Colonialism normalizes prejudice against anyone who doesn't fall into the European standard, which has led to general incomprehension about and indifference to Indigenous suffering. It creates an us versus them dynamic that actually goes beyond racism to include other forms of discrimination, like sexism. Indigenous women are viewed as hypersexual and immoral by settlers. These views remain embedded in today and continue to frame Indigenous women as sexually available and inherently worthless. In 2022, Statistics Canada reported that 6 in 10 Indigenous women, aka 63%, experienced either physical assault or sexual assault, compared to only 45% of non-Indigenous women. Because of these stereotypes, many cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women and Two-Spirit people have been ignored by the justice system and the media. Victims are often made to be invisible. Their cases are either buried or only covered through association with deviancy. In general, the media tends to portray Indigenous people as criminals or wrongdoers, rather than victims. But an intersectional perspective shows that why Indigenous and Two-Spirit LGBTQIA+ individuals actually face this at a way heightened level. The lack of productive media coverage is paired with the failures of the RCMP and the courts, which carry colonial stereotypes and often neglect or misclassify cases. The National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women actually explicitly calls out these failures through their findings, through their research in their final report. In 2015, the Government of Canada published the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which included 94 calls to action. Call to Action 41 actually explicitly calls to appoint a public inquiry into the causes and remedies for the disproportionate victimization of Aboriginal women and girls. Growing public awareness contributed to the launch of the national inquiry that we're talking about in this video. It's also important to note that the missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit movement exists beyond the inquiry. The Indigenous communities and activists have been fighting for recognition of this ongoing issue long before 2016. The National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls was created to examine the disproportionate rates of violences experienced by Indigenous women, girls, and later expanded to include Two-Spirit and LGBTQIA+ individuals. It was launched September 2016, and it released an interim report in 2017 and then its final report in 2019. For the sake of the video, we are just going to be talking about the final report, as that has most of the information about the inquiry. It was carried out by a team of commissioners, researchers, elders, knowledge keepers, legal experts, community members. They all worked together in documenting the realities of Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit individuals in Canada. The research process relied on multiple teams responsible for different aspects of the work. Evidence came from community and institutional hearings, in-depth case research, statistical reviews, historical analysis, testimony from elders and knowledge keepers, and forensic examinations of police files. The inquiry's analytical framework used a culturally relevant feminism and intersectional gender-based analysis grounded in Indigenous methodology. Their strategy relied on cross-cutting lines of inquiry. This was meant to ensure that every perspective could be integrated. Here's a screenshot from the final report itself, showing in depth exactly all the perspectives they took. I thought this was important to show because it actually shows it just goes beyond the categories of race and gender. And something I'd like to make note that this inquiry actually does is actually makes distinctions between Metis, Inuit, and First Nations people, or First Nations, which is often not done in mainstream media and government documents. The vision of the National Inquiry is to build a foundation that allows Indigenous women and girls to reclaim their power and place and to uncover what violence really looks like for these communities. The final report clearly states that truths shared in these hearings tell the accurate story of thousands of acts of genocide against First Nation, Inuit, Métis women, girls, and Two-Spirit LGBTQIA+ individuals. Their final report, which I've been referencing a lot, is actually called Reclaiming Power in Place, and it was released June 3rd in 2019. The report shows 231 calls for justice. These calls for justice provide a concrete roadmap of how the Government of Canada, and honestly all levels of government, can do to protect Indigenous women, girls, Two-Spirit LGBTQIA plus individuals, and uphold their human rights and their Indigenous rights. Now you may be wondering, Marie, when are you going to actually talk about intersectionality? It is a concept developed by Kimberly Crenshaw, a leading scholar in Black feminism. It describes how overlapping social categories shape distinct experiences with discrimination. For example, an Indigenous woman is multiple burdened because of her experiences that are shaped by simultaneously her race, her gender, and honestly any other category that may apply to her. As Crenshaw explains, an intersectional experience is greater than the sum of racism and sexism. These categories don't simply add together; they interact and they weave together, and that's how we understand how discrimination is felt and understood by different people. Intersectionality was first introduced as a concept to critique mainstream feminism that solely looked at the perspectives of white women. Today, it is expanded into an interdisciplinary tool that is used across a broad range of social sciences, not just applying feminism. While it continues to develop, the concept is essential for understanding how people experience injustice not because of one isolated identity, but because of a culmination of a bunch of different identities. Intersectionality is central to understanding how the national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, because it explains how there is a disproportionate victimization for these communities in particular. Mainstream idea of Indigenous human rights often overlooks gendered power relations, leaving out the specific human rights violations that Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit LGBTQIA plus individuals face in particular. Intersectionality actually corrects this overlooking because it addresses how racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, and economic marginalizations actually interact rather than operate separately, because they don't. They intertwine, they overlap, and they intensify each other. And they uniquely target Indigenous women and gender diverse people because of these overlapping categories. Without an intersectional lens, the inquiry would risk repeating those same shortcomings that have historically erased the experiences of Indigenous women and gender diverse people in a broader discussion of Indigenous rights. This makes the inquiry's analysis by using intersectionality actually more accurate and way more useful to actually transforming Canada into a safer place for everyone. It leaves no one behind, and it actually addresses the different experiences that people face and why. Thank you guys for watching. I hope you guys learned something new about intersectionality and the national inquiry we talked about today, and I will see you in the next one.